When we discuss whether or not Black Americans have culture, it's typically a conversation that is met with a lot of resistance. And so, in this video, we're going to be discussing why some people say that Black Americans don't have culture. In defense of Black culture, you'll typically hear Black people say that, oh, well, we have fashion, we have music, we have food, and those elements are ultimately emblematic of Black culture. But critics would say that there is not a cultural adhesive that unites all Black people. And what would that cultural adhesive be that unites every single Black person? So I want you to think about that question for a moment, and then we're going to come back to it at the end of the video. Okay, so why do some people believe that music, fashion, and food do not really suffice as Black culture? Well, ultimately, you could say that that's because for some people, they believe that those would be considered cultural artifacts. So what is an artifact? An artifact is an object made by a human being, typically of cultural or historical interest. So you would say things like tools, pottery, jewelry, coins that we like discover from ancient civilizations. Those would be cultural artifacts. You could ultimately say things like pyramids and the Mayan calendar and Dead Sea Scrolls. Those are also cultural artifacts made by people during those historical time periods. So, a little bit of history. Black people are descendants of a colonized people, and we as a collective throughout history have produced these cultural artifacts of music, fashion, and food to educate, entertain, and describe who we are as Black Americans. So, let me give you an analogy. Let's say that there's this museum, okay? And we have these cultural artifacts that are ultimately on display produced by Black people. We have music, we have fashion, and we have, what else did I say? Food, okay? So when Black people invite other races of people into the museum, right? That they are then expected to not touch these sacred artifacts that, Black people see as being emblematic of Black culture, right? But then within the museum, you start to see non Black folks that start to talk with the Black accent, use African American vernacular English, dress in more, have like more of a hood aesthetic or more of a hip hop, aesthetic. And what you'll ultimately hear people say is, oh, well, now we need to gatekeep our culture. And some critics will ultimately say that the need to have to gatekeep your culture is actually an indication that Black people don't have a culture, because you don't hear Latinos saying that they have to gatekeep their culture. You don't hear the Asians saying that they need to gatekeep their culture, but for some reason, you hear a lot of Black people say that our culture needs to be gate kept. Okay, so then so if we have music, if we have food, if we have culture, then why do people not believe that those elements, are not sufficient enough to say that we have culture? And I believe it's ultimately because what Black people are lacking is a cultural construct that is built into the people that then is preserved over time. So, what constitutes a cultural construct? There are a couple of elements. It has to be built into a people. All people must all people must participate or experience this cultural construct, must pass through it. It cannot be replicated by any other people. And then fourthly or lastly, it has a degree of intergenerationality. It has to be preserved and safeguarded by the people. So, some examples of cultural constructs, right? You would say that or within Latino culture, you have the Day of the Dead, right? Where you have the ofrenda, and you have, everyone's eating pan de los muertos, things like that. That is a cultural construct that is built into a people that all people kind of experience, that all Latinos kind of experience, right? You also have the quinceañera, right? So that is an experience that is traditional. It is something that young Latino women experience, and it ultimately instructs Latino men in a way to, it kind of informs them on how to then treat younger women, right? That's essentially the idea. Also, within Africa, you have things like the dowry system, right? Where, the man has to, ultimately appease the parents. It's an experience that, all people have to ultimately go through, and it is a construct that is then taught to the very next generation and passed down to them. So, with that being said, because there is no cultural construct for black people, we would say, some people would say that we don't have culture. Instead, what we are is a collective of black people with the shared experience of being black. That that black culture is more like a tiered system, that we have black people who grew up in the inner city who have more of a hood essence. We have black people who grew up bohemian, who grew up in the suburbs and have more of a bohemian essence. And then we have other categories of black people who kind of grew up alternative, the cosplayers and the Afropunk community, for example. So you would say that each person has their own individuated personality and character based off of where they grew up and how they understand themselves and how they self-actualize. Now, in defense of black culture, there is Kwanzaa. We do have Kwanzaa, but into today, we don't really hear much talk about Kwanzaa because the hip hop community is the dominant culture. Like the hip hop community is the face of black culture, and they don't really talk about Kwanzaa. So going back to the question that I asked at the beginning is, what is the cultural adhesive that then would unite everyone within the collective? And because that there isn't anything definitive that we can ultimately say unites all black people, other than the shared experience of being American, people would say that we don't have culture, that there is no cultural construct. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think that is at least more room for us to be creative in how we understand ourselves as people. For example, we are Mukimne. And we get to then create our own identity of how we understand ourselves and how we self actualize, creating an individuated character of who we are as people. So it really depends on who you ask.